Time, the land looked the same: cracked soil, scattered rocks, and dry wind moving across the sand. No rivers flowed through it. No trees grew there. And during the summer months, the heat rising from the ground could make the horizon look like it was melting. Most people simply called it the Red Mesa Desert. Farmers from nearby towns had looked at that land for generations, and every generation had reached the same conclusion: nothing grows there. For people who lived in the fertile parts of the valley, farming meant green fields, irrigation canals, and predictable harvests. The desert offered none of those things. No water, no shade, no guarantee that a single seed would survive. So year after year, the land remained untouched, until one man began looking at it differently. His name was Daniel Ortega. Daniel wasn't the richest farmer in Red Mesa Valley. In fact, his farm was smaller than most. His land sat on the edge of town, where the fertile soil slowly faded into the dry desert. For years, Daniel had grown the same crops as everyone else: corn, wheat, beans, the kind of crops that required regular rain and reliable soil. But over time, something started to change in the valley. The weather became less predictable. Rainfall dropped. Summers became hotter. And every year, the harvests became slightly smaller than the year before. Many farmers blamed the changing climate. Others blamed bad luck. But Daniel spent his evenings doing something different. He watched. He studied the land. And most importantly, he asked questions that other farmers didn't. One afternoon, while driving his old pickup truck along a dusty road near the desert, Daniel stopped at a small hill overlooking the Red Mesa Plains. The wind moved across the sand in slow waves. Most people would have seen emptiness. Daniel saw something else: opportunity. Because while everyone believed the desert was useless, Daniel had spent months researching something very few farmers in the valley had heard about: desert farming. In certain parts of the world, places even drier than Red Mesa, farmers were successfully growing crops using modern irrigation systems. They used underground drip lines, solar-powered water pumps, and crops that were specially adapted to dry climates. The technology wasn't common in Red Mesa Valley. In fact, most farmers considered it too expensive, too risky, too experimental. But Daniel had been running the numbers, and the more he studied it, the more one idea kept returning to his mind. What if the land everyone ignored was actually the cheapest land in the entire valley? Because while fertile farmland sold for enormous prices, the desert land outside town cost almost nothing. No one wanted it, which meant Daniel could afford acres of it for the same price as a tiny farm elsewhere. Of course, the risk was enormous. Without water, even the best soil was useless, and drilling wells in desert land was expensive with no guarantee of success. But Daniel noticed something interesting when he studied the maps of the valley. Beneath parts of the Red Mesa Desert ran a deep underground aquifer, a slow-moving layer of water trapped beneath the rock for thousands of years. Some ranchers in distant areas had already drilled wells into it. The water was there. It was just far below the surface. For most farmers, the cost of drilling that deep would have been too much. But Daniel saw the problem differently. If he bought desert land cheap enough, the cost of drilling might still make the entire project possible. That evening, Daniel drove home while the sun set across the valley. The orange light stretched across the desert horizon, turning the empty land into a glowing red landscape. Most people looked at the desert and saw failure. Daniel saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. Over the next few weeks, he began doing something that surprised everyone in town. He started buying desert land. At first, people assumed it was a mistake. Land agents were happy to sell it. The prices were almost unbelievably low. For the cost of a few acres of farmland, Daniel was able to buy entire stretches of desert property. Soon, word began spreading through Red Mesa Valley. Daniel Ortega was buying land where nobody farmed. At the small cafe in town where farmers gathered each morning, the conversations began. Did you hear what Daniel bought? Desert land. A few farmers laughed. What's he planning to grow there? Sand. Another farmer shook his head. That land has been useless for 100 years. But Daniel didn't argue. He didn't try to explain his plan. Instead, he spent the following months preparing the land. Survey teams arrived to measure the property. Engineers inspected the ground. And eventually, large drilling equipment appeared on the empty desert fields. For the first time in decades, machines were working in the Red Mesa Desert. Some farmers drove out just to watch. They stood beside their trucks, looking across the empty land where drilling rigs were pushing deep into the earth. One man leaned against his pickup and said, "If he doesn't find water, he just buried his entire future in the sand." And in many ways, that was true, because Daniel had taken a risk larger than anything he had ever attempted. If the wells failed, the land would remain exactly what it had always been, empty desert. But if the water was really there, then the land everyone had ignored for generations might become the most valuable land in the entire valley. And everything depended on what those drilling machines would find deep beneath the desert floor. For weeks, the drilling machines continued working in the middle of the Red Mesa desert. From a distance, the machines looked almost strange against the empty horizon. Huge metal towers stood where there had once been nothing but sand and rock. The sound of engines echoed across the dry plains as drills pushed deeper and deeper into the ground. Every day, Daniel Ortega arrived before sunrise. He parked his old pickup truck near the drilling site and watched the work quietly. For Daniel, each meter the drill moved downward meant hope. But it also meant risk, because drilling for water in desert land was never guaranteed. Sometimes wells reached hundreds of feet underground and still found nothing. Just dry rock. Just dust. Just silence. The engineers working on the site explained the reality clearly. "There's water somewhere under this valley," one of them told Daniel. But finding the right spot, that's the gamble. And that gamble was costing Daniel nearly everything he had saved. Each day of drilling meant more expenses. Fuel, equipment, labor. But Daniel didn't stop. The machines continued digging deeper into the earth, day after day, week after week. Meanwhile, the rest of the valley continued watching with curiosity. Some farmers drove out to the desert just to see the strange project for themselves. They stood beside their trucks, staring across the wide, empty land where drilling rigs were working under the scorching sun. One farmer laughed quietly. "That land hasn't grown a single plant in 100 years. Another shook his head. "He's chasing a dream." But Daniel kept working, because he knew something important. Every great opportunity looked like madness in the beginning. Then, one afternoon, something changed. The drilling crew had reached a depth deeper than any previous well in the area. The drill slowed. The engine noise lowered. The workers gathered around the rig, carefully watching the pressure gauges. Daniel stood nearby, his eyes fixed on the equipment. For a moment, the entire desert felt quiet. Then suddenly, the ground trembled slightly. A low rumble came from deep below the earth. And seconds later, a burst of muddy water shot upward through the drilling pipe. At first it was only a thin stream. Then it grew stronger. Within minutes, water was flowing steadily from the well. Cold, clear, real. The workers cheered. Daniel didn't say anything. He simply stood there watching the water spill across the dry desert ground. For the first time in generations, water had surfaced in that exact spot of the Red Mesa desert. And that single moment changed everything. Because water meant life. Water meant crops. Water meant the desert might not be empty after all. But Daniel understood something else too. Finding water was only the first step. Turning desert into farmland would require something much harder. Infrastructure, pipes, irrigation systems. So Daniel immediately began the next phase of his plan. Within weeks, construction crews arrived. Long trenches were dug across the desert land. Thousands of meters of irrigation pipes were installed beneath the soil. Solar panels were placed beside the wells to power water pumps. Large water storage tanks rose above the sand like metal towers. And slowly, the empty desert began transforming into something nobody in Red Mesa Valley had ever seen before. A farm. But the valley still didn't believe it would work. Farmers continued driving past the project and shaking their heads. One man pointed at the irrigation pipes stretching across the sand. "He can pump water all he wants. That soil won't grow anything." Another farmer laughed. "Maybe he'll grow cactus." But Daniel wasn't planting the same crops as everyone else. Because the research he had done months earlier had led him to something very specific. Certain crops actually thrived in dry climates. Dates, olives, certain types of melons, and special desert-adapted vegetables. Crops that didn't require heavy rainfall. Crops that could survive extreme heat. So one early morning, as the sun rose across the Red Mesa desert, Daniel planted the first seeds. The workers carefully placed irrigation lines across the land. Drip systems slowly released water directly into the soil around each plant. It was a farming method very few people in the valley had ever seen. Instead of flooding fields with water like traditional farms, Daniel's system fed each plant slowly and precisely, drop by drop. And now, all that remained was the hardest part, waiting. Because desert land didn't change overnight. Days passed, then weeks. The valley watched carefully. Many people expected the same result that had happened for generations. Nothing. But something strange began appearing in the desert. Small green shoots. Tiny plants pushing through the sand. At first, there were only a few. Then more. Slowly, patches of green began spreading across the once empty land. From the hill overlooking the valley, the change was almost unbelievable. Where there had once been nothing but dry soil, there were now rows of growing crops. The desert was turning green. But the real test was still ahead. Because growing plants was one thing. Harvesting a successful crop in the desert was something no one in Red Mesa Valley had ever seen before. For weeks after the first green shoots appeared in the Red Mesa Desert, people across the valley kept watching Daniel Ortega's farm with quiet curiosity. At first, many believed the plants would disappear as quickly as they had appeared. Desert land had fooled farmers before. A few early rains, a few temporary plants, and then the harsh heat would return and wipe everything away. But this time something was different. Daniel's irrigation system continued feeding water slowly into the soil every single day. Instead of flooding the land, small drip lines delivered precise amounts of water directly to each plant. It was careful, controlled, and incredibly efficient. The crops began growing faster. Rows of plants stretched further across the desert land. Small leaves turned into strong stems. The once empty fields slowly transformed into organized lines of green vegetation. From the hills overlooking Red Mesa Valley, the sight became impossible to ignore. A place that had been dry for generations was now slowly turning into farmland. But many farmers still believed the same thing. It won't last. They had seen unusual things happen in agriculture before. Sometimes plants looked healthy early in the season but failed before harvest. Sometimes extreme heat destroyed entire crops overnight. So the valley waited. Summer arrived. The heat became intense. The desert wind blew hot air across the fields. But Daniel's crops continued growing. Because the drip irrigation system protected the roots from drying out. Water went exactly where the plants needed it. Nothing was wasted. And slowly, the plants began producing fruit. Rows of melons started forming beneath thick green leaves. Date palms grew taller beside the irrigation lines. Olive trees began spreading their branches across the land. By late summer, Daniel's farm no longer looked like a desert experiment. It looked like a working farm. And that was when the first visitors arrived. A produce buyer from a nearby city had heard about something unusual happening in Red Mesa Valley. A farm growing crops in the middle of the desert. At first, he assumed it was exaggerated. But curiosity eventually brought him to Daniel's land. The buyer parked his truck beside the dusty road and walked across the field. He stopped beside one of the melon rows. Then he bent down and picked one up. It was large, healthy, perfectly ripe. He turned toward Daniel with surprise. "You grew these here?" Daniel nodded. The buyer looked across the fields again. Dozens of rows stretched across the land. And suddenly he realized something important. Because while most farms in the valley were struggling with unpredictable weather, Daniel's desert farm was actually more stable. His irrigation system controlled the water supply. His crops were adapted to heat. And the dry climate reduced many plant diseases that affected traditional farms. Within a few weeks, trucks began arriving. Produce buyers, agricultural investors, even government researchers curious about the technology Daniel had used. The desert farm was becoming famous. And across the valley, farmers who once laughed at Daniel were now driving out to see it for themselves. Some stood quietly beside the fence watching the harvest. Workers carefully picked melons and loaded crates into trucks. Rows of date palms swayed gently in the desert wind. Olive trees stretched across land that had once been considered worthless. One farmer leaned against his truck and said quietly, "I never thought I'd see crops growing here." Another shook his head slowly. "That land was for sale for years. We could have bought it for almost nothing." But the truth was simple. No one believed it was possible. Except Daniel. Because Daniel had never looked at the desert the same way others did. Where most people saw limits, he saw potential. Where others saw risk, he saw opportunity. And within 2 years, the Red Mesa Desert Farm had become one of the most productive farms in the entire region. The land that had once been ignored was now incredibly valuable. Agricultural investors began buying nearby desert property, hoping to copy Daniel's success. New irrigation systems appeared across the plains. Solar pumps powered new wells. And slowly, the Red Mesa Desert began transforming into an entirely new farming region. But for Daniel, the success had never been about proving people wrong. One evening, as the sun set across the valley, Daniel stood on a small hill overlooking his farm. The sky turned orange as the desert wind moved through the rows of crops. Workers finished loading the final trucks of the day, and the once empty land stretched across the horizon, filled with green fields. A visitor standing beside Daniel asked the same question many people had asked before. How did you know this would work? Daniel looked across the fields quietly. Then he smiled slightly. I didn't know. I just knew everyone else had already decided it couldn't. Because sometimes the greatest opportunities are hidden in the places everyone else has already given up on. And in the Red Mesa Desert, a piece of land once ignored by an entire valley had become the foundation of a new future. All because one farmer looked at the same empty desert and imagined something different.